Presentation of dialogue on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore family's legacy of building the great state of Idaho.
Coming up, his agency represents some of the most vulnerable people in the world. I talk with Michel Gobadon, the United States representative to the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. That's Dialogue. Next, stay tuned. Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Marcia Franklin. A welcome as well to those of you tuning in on public radio and the World Wide Web. In mid-February, the Boise airport was the scene of a homecoming of sorts as several refugees from Iraq landed in the City of Trees to begin new lives. But they won't be alone. They'll join more than 900 Iraqis who've resettled to Idaho, 300 of them just in the past year. Over the past decade, more than 6,500 refugees from countries all over the world came to Idaho. They find a welcoming atmosphere but face enormous challenges learning a new language, finding jobs, and adapting to cultural differences. Now, my guest today works for the agency that helps shelter refugees in danger, resettle them in other countries, or assist them to return home when danger has passed. Michel Gobadon is the U.S. and Caribbean representative to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. Founded in 1950 in the aftermath of World War II, the UNHCR had a mandate to help refugees from the war for 3 years and then disband. 60 years later, it operates in more than 100 countries, working with 10.5 million refugees and more than 14 million people internally displaced in their own countries by conflict. And here to tell us more about the UNHCR's work, including the latest on the situation in Haiti, part of the region he oversees, is Michel Gobadon. Mr. Gobadon has been working in his position since 2006, but has been with the UNHCR for more than 25 years in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and Australia. Welcome to you. Or perhaps I should say bienvenue.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
And one note, because this is a taped program, there will be no phone calls. Let's start right off and explain to people really what a refugee is, because I think especially with a lot of natural disasters happening in the world, people think that by definition people fleeing from those natural disasters like in Haiti are refugees, but they're not necessarily. Let's take a look at the definition of a refugee. A refugee is someone who's been forced to flee their country and is unable or unwilling to return because of a well-founded fear of persecution based on race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion. I'm sure those words were parsed very carefully, over the years. But in point of fact, in situations like Haiti, your agency doesn't have a huge role because these are not classic refugees.
No, absolutely. And the UN family at large is, of course, very much involved there. There was, before the earthquake, a very important UN peacekeeping mission called MINUSTA, which unfortunately has been also very much affected by the earthquake, and the UN is therefore responding to the earthquake. The size of the disaster, however, is such that we are all trying to see can we chip in and provide some assistance, because nobody will be able to solve this alone.
And you've been just down in the region, yes?
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about what you've seen and what the UNHCR is able to do with its limited resources.
Yeah, well, the UN is dividing the attention to different sectors in what we call in our jargon clusters. So you have people looking at nutrition, people looking at sanitation, people looking at shelter, people looking at reconstruction, etc. And these articulate different agencies together, including voluntary agency and sometimes including some bilateral donors. We are working with the High Commissioner for Human Rights in what we call the protection cluster, which is trying to make sure that the most vulnerable people are being taken care of in all the different assistance mechanisms. We're very concerned with the people the most vulnerable, women who are left alone, unaccompanied minors, and we have to make sure that when you shape up the relief assistance, these particular groups are given particular attention so they will not slip through the holes of the net.
In your experience working in aid work, how does this disaster rate?
Well, before going there, of course, looked at all the TV images, I looked at the papers, etc. And when you are in Port-au-Prince, it is still absolutely shocking. I was there after most of the bodies had been removed, etc. So the most dramatic scenes were not there, but the extent of destruction is just impressive. The extent of destruction also of government structure is amazing. The earthquake hit the capital, which is basically where any relief system organizes itself, and there that system does not exist. I mean, all the ministries are down. I mean, the parliament is down. The government operates out of a police station. Can you imagine? Most of the agencies who are providing relief have themselves suffered losses. So you
I've
don't
seen the picture of the UN building.
Yeah, the UN building was dramatic, completely smashed. We lost 99 people, and there are still some 40 missing. And this is, of course, nothing compared to what the local population suffered, but it means everybody there is in a state of shock. The local population and the people are trying to respond.
When disasters like this happen, understandably, people want to help. And some people from Idaho went down to help as well, and you know the story. What's your sense about what lessons can be learned and the caution in individuals trying to assist children in particular in these type of disasters?
Well, the reaction to the earthquake has been superb from the whole world and certainly from this country. I mean, whether it's financial contribution, expressions of interest, people calling to see what can we do, etc., it has been overwhelming. So that has been very welcome, of course. The reaction to children, of course, we understand very well. I mean, there were orphans in Haiti, which is an extremely poor country, before the earthquake, and there will be more now. And there is a large population of children whom we don't know whether they are orphans or not. We would call unaccompanied, unattended minors. And I quite understand the willingness of people who are in better situations to say, well, these are the most vulnerable, therefore we should do something for them. We, however, have to be very careful when we respond to these needs, and it's difficult to channel emotions in these moments.
But in fact, isn't there kind of a rule that 2 years after a natural disaster?
Yes, we have our own guidelines, but they are shared very much by the UNICEF, the UN Agency for Children, and by many non-governmental organizations who deal with children, like Save the Children, etc. That in a natural disaster, what you have is certainly to identify children who are alone and try to find ways to deal with them in the area that will protect them from abuses, but certainly not react too quickly to questions of adoptions, etc., for a couple of reasons. One, during a disaster, many families will even tell you, take my child, because they are so desperate and so uncertain about the future that they are prepared to make this sort of recommendation. It doesn't mean at all that a few months after they will still feel the same. Children may seem happy to be able to move, but also a few months after they may change completely. Children who you think are orphans or you think are unaccompanied may very well still have relatives who are prepared to look after them. So what we believe is that you need a prudential time where you let things settle down.
About 2 years?
2 years is what experience have proved can be the sort of length you need to reestablish family ties. And we have processes which we call in our jargon the best interest determination, where panels, not only one agency, but a panel involving various agencies will look at the case of every child and decide what is best. And I am sure that on time, adoption will be something that will be necessary. I'm not saying it's wrong, but it has to follow proper channels. You have to realize that during a disaster, there are groups that are trying to take advantage of that. People want to traffic children, either to sell them for adoption or to sell them for much more dark purpose, like organ traffic, etc. You don't know. And we've seen cases there where children were trying to be skimmed away, etc. In this case, I have no doubt the intentions were good, but the moment you cross a border without any legal papers that show that you're doing a legitimate business, all suspicions are arisen. And then you give also the impression that it's a free-for-all for children. So we have to be careful.
I know one of the things that you're pleased about is that countries are not going to be deporting Haitians right now back into that situation. And that was a result of negotiations between the UN and countries.
Yeah. Well, we are asking countries not to do that. In the case of the US, I mean, Secretary Napolitano very quickly took the decision to extend a temporary protection status, which is a particular figure of protection in the US, not to deport Haitians who may be in illegal status here, which we think is very welcome. For one, is that it's not adding additional pressure to a country which is already having difficulties to cope, but it will also allow these people to work and therefore to remit some funds to their relatives there, and is going to contribute to the relief effort in this manner.
Let's talk about the larger refugee issue. And again, we're talking political refugees now. There's been a changing nature of the refugee crisis over the years. As I mentioned in my introduction, your agency first started with a 3-year mandate. You were supposed to go away and help just the refugees after World War II. What are we seeing now that's so dramatically different from that time that's meant that your agency has had to, it now has a permanent mandate?
Yeah. Well, until early 90s, we were dealing mostly with refugees that had, after the Second World War, who had fled conflicts resulting from the Cold War. In 1990, there was, and my organization has a 5-year mandate, which was renewed every 5 years, with the hope that eventually things would change. You will remember that in 1990, people were talking about a new world order, about a complete change of circumstances that would perhaps see the end of the refugee crisis in the world. And that did not happen. In 95, we were given a permanent mandate, which is a poor reflection on what was happening. What has changed, I think, is that the nature of conflict is leading people to leave for same persecution, same misery that they are subjected to in the countries where they live, but for reasons that are much less clear to the rest of the world. I mean, the conflicts now appear to be based on ethnic or religious differences. Very often you have a good, solid economical reason behind that.
So you don't have nation states to negotiate with necessarily like you used to. There's kind of rogue parties that are creating this misery.
Many of the persecutors today tend to be, yes, exactly what we call non-state agents. You know, people who are not even political opposition, but tend to be more like criminal gangs, etc. And that makes it very impossible for us to access them. So it's one added difficulty. Also, the conflict that is based on these ethnic and religious tensions, even when it comes to an end, is much more difficult to resolve in terms of reconciliation than when you had a more ideological conflict in the past.
So it's not black and white anymore,
no.
You know, communism versus democracy. The lines are all blurred, and I know that some people amazingly have been in camps now, refugee camps, for an extremely long time, up to 20 years in some instances, trying to figure out what to do. You know, as much aid as you do provide, there are still some people who are very concerned about conditions that are set up by these rogue nation states and the conditions in the camps. And last year I interviewed Philip Gourevitch, who's a journalist who spent a lot of time in Rwanda. And let's listen to a comment that he made about the camps that he saw.
What really bothered me in Rwanda was this false promise of protection. When you send the UN in, when you say, here we are, when you start urging people to gather, and this happened in Rwanda, people were told, come to this UN base for protection, people who were being hunted in the streets. And then the UN withdrew from that base, and those people were slaughtered, simply handed over to their killers. That's a disgrace that it's very hard to recover from. And right now, next door in Congo, you have the world's largest UN peacekeeping mission in the field. It's the most expensive in the world. It costs more than $1 billion a year, and it has done nothing to ameliorate the position of endangered people there.
It's pretty strong words there. What's your feeling about safety in the camps and what's been the lessons learned from Rwanda?
Yeah, I think there is a difference with a refugee situation. What we're talking about, displacement within their own country. So there were peacekeeping forces, and they were instructed by New York, because of positions of member states, not to take certain actions. And I think this is, yes, it is a UN failure. I don't think anybody who has witnessed what's happening in Rwanda would disagree with that. But it goes beyond the responsibility of one agency. It's been the whole international system has shied away, and that includes our agencies and our member states who call the shots at the end.
And we should say that there's great danger for your workers as well in these types of situations, not just for the refugees themselves. They're increasingly going into more and more dangerous situations.
Well, one is because we work increasingly in the country where the conflict is taking place. You know, 15 years ago, we dealt only with refugees, which means with people who by definition are outside their country. Now, among the people we deal with, it's about 1/3 are refugees and 2/3 are people who are still within their...
We call them internally displaced.
Internally displaced people. So for them, the international legal instruments for refugees do not apply, but we still have to try to protect them. But very often they are squeezed between the different parties to the conflict. We need peacekeepers to work in this context, to help us to guarantee security, but they can't be everywhere all the time. They have paid, peacekeepers have paid the price. I mean, don't forget how many were killed in the Sudan by some of these groups, etc. So it's becoming much more difficult for everyone to try to reach our intended beneficiaries.
Let's talk about the process once people leave the camps, although actually I should probably back up and say that there are more solutions to this, or what you call durable solutions, than just resettling people in other countries. I mean, the ultimate goal is for the people to be able to go back to their own country if they can, or to be repatriated to a neighboring country and get citizenship. But if they do go through the resettlement process and come to a country like the United States, what's the process? As I understand, the U.S. Sets a target goal, and I think it's 80,000, up to 80,000 refugees that we can take in the coming year. Is that
Yes.
correct? And then people petition and come through, get recommended through the UN and other non-governmental organizations?
Yes, that's more or less how it goes. I mean, the target is set because this is, first I should say that the resettlement is a discretionary decision by a government. There is nothing in international laws or international conventions that would compel a government to resettle. So in the case of the US and a few other countries that resettle, like Canada and Australia, etc., it's a decision of the government saying we are going to contribute in this manner. So for us, it's a very nice program because it's an addition to what are things prescribed for in international law. Now, in the case of the US, it takes about 74% of the refugees we submit for resettlement. When we submit them, the US will process them and will not necessarily accept all those we submit. So the US has absolute discretion to decide whom they accept and whom they...
And we see some refugees here in Boise in the Language Center. I just want to explain what that is to folks. Those are the ones who've made it in, past
Lovely.
all of that.
Well, I think the average acceptance rate of those we submit by the US is 85%, so it's a very good acceptance rate. But we work on the basis of criteria that governments tell us. They said this is who we would like to have. The beauty of the US program is that it's essentially focused on the needs, which is who are the people you really need to resettle to make their life better and also to help us in a better management of the camps where they come from. It's not based on will they integrate very easily or do they already speak English. It's not based on criteria that would make the selection much more difficult. It's really who is in the most need, and this is a fundamental criteria in humanitarian response to the plight of refugees.
And we saw at the beginning of the program some Iraqis coming in just in the last 2 years. A large number of refugees coming into the United States has been from Iraq. Yes.
Yes.
And that's helped take the pressure off some of the other neighboring countries that have been harboring them.
It has, and this is why we are very interested in continuing the program with the US. Of course, the program has benefited immediately those refugees who were able to come here, and we have worked on criteria of what we call vulnerability. Women alone, people who are particularly targeted because they had worked with the US or with other members of the multinational forces, etc. Some religious minorities, people who are particularly vulnerable and for whom return to Iraq we thought would never be possible. So these people have benefited directly. But the fact that the US and some other countries would offload those small proportion of the refugees from Syria and Jordan has allowed us to show to these countries that there was indeed international burden sharing, and therefore offer better space for us to negotiate in these countries proper treatment of refugees. And for example, since the resettlement program started, we've seen detention has come down, borders have been more accessible, conditions for refugees in these countries have been more tolerable.
Do we owe the Iraqis more because we engendered a war there?
Well, I don't like to use the word "owe" because it means that we are all starting to point fingers, etc. I think there are Iraqis who have been targeted for very specific reasons in Iraq. As I said, some for their religion, but some because of their association with some of Western countries. Not only the US government, etc., some just because they worked for international press, for example, etc. Now, those people are much more at risk than others, and therefore I think it's fair that the countries that have a resettlement program consider these as priority criteria.
Let's talk about when they come to America, how is it decided that they might come to Boise or Twin Falls?
That has nothing to do with my agency. We make a submission to the State Department. The State Department will make a first assessment of whether these are acceptable within the criteria. Usually there it goes quite well because we know the criteria and we work very closely with the State Department. Then it goes to DHS that will make
Department of Human Services.
Yeah, then DHS, the Department of
Homeland Security
will do the security clearance, and then it goes to the ORR, who will decide, working with agency, where to send them. And there we have no role in that.
And that's when the non-governmental organizations step in, the church groups and such, and resettle them. You spoke of Homeland Security, and it reminds me, I wanted to ask you, 9/11 changed a lot of this because then there was increased focus on concerns about terrorists coming into the country, and we still have a number of people in detention who've applied for asylum but are detained. And I mean, there's been great concern that the process slowed down because of 9/11, but I understand things are changing.
It is. This is a difficult discussion because we have to try to balance the interest of the individuals that we are concerned with, of course, the legitimate interest of states. Now, after 9/11, Congress and the government have enacted some legislation to protect these countries from accepting people who would be a danger to the country. Now, there is nothing wrong with that. It's absolutely legitimate. Now, the legislation was such, in particular the one that is referred to as material support, that it prohibits the admission in the US anyone who has provided any sort of support to groups considered as terrorist. Now, that in the reading can include, and I remember a case, which is perhaps the excessive example, but a woman that her husband had been killed, she had been raped, and then obliged to feed the bad guys who did all that. And that was considered, she supported them, and therefore a strict interpretation of the legislation would prohibit her
because she gave food to the bad guys.
Yeah.
She was considered a
risk. Just as if she had funded, $10 million to guerrilla groups. Now, these are things that we are trying to change. Now, it's not a pitched battle between us and the government. There are people in governments, in Congress, in civil society trying to see how we can bring adjustments to make sure that when the net has been cast too wide, the people who are unfairly caught by the net can be released.
And there are a lot of people in prison as well, in detention right now.
So it has complicated things. The government has responded with quite a series of waivers, which have allowed already quite a few people to be exempt from this legislation. We are looking at still ways to improve it. But as I say, it's a difficult balance between the legitimate interest of the governments and our concern for the people who can be trapped unfairly by that legislation, which does mean the legislation is not something that had some solid grounds. This is what
diplomats deal with every single day.
Yes.
We showed pictures earlier of some refugees in Boise at the Learning Center. Talk a little bit, you've worked, as I said, for more than 25 years in this field, about the resilience of refugees around the world. I've met many of them, sat with them, and it is pretty amazing considering the trauma that many of them have been through, how they bounce back and start contributing to society.
Yeah, I think we're all guilty. For many years, the image that one liked to show of refugee was someone waiting for food to be distributed, or lost in a tent doing nothing, etc. And it was trying to attract the pity of the world to say, look, these poor people, we have to give them something. We have changed, the voluntary agencies and ourselves over the past year to say, yes, but this is something very often that happens at the beginning of a crisis. But refugees are just waiting for a moment to be given a chance to do something. And when they're given this chance, I can tell you, they grab it and run with it. And this country is full of examples of people who have come after living years and years and sometimes decades in camps where there was no hope on site. They come here and they take 2 jobs or 3 jobs to try to make ends meet. Many of them study, and I have cases of people I was mentioning earlier, someone who started reading and writing in a refugee camp which we were managing when he was 16. He's now 32, has been admitted here, and he's passing a master's degree in Syracuse. It's not all of them, but it's not the only one. I'm saying there are the number of examples of success among refugees are important. Give them a chance. They will work. They know where they come from. They know what they've lost. They will be far more aggressive than most of us would be to make their life a success.
Well, in fact, I think I was looking at one of the statistics that your site has, and talked about something like 1 in 100 people in the United States now is either a refugee or descended from a refugee. Yes. And of course, I don't know, there was no such definition of refugee when my grandparents came here, but they were refugees fleeing persecution. So a lot of people in America have that personal connection anyway to being a refugee. It's part of the fabric of the country.
Indeed, and that's why I think you have such a generous resettlement program. The government wouldn't have it if it was not underwritten by tacit support of large swaths of the population.
Well, let's talk though a little bit about, just very briefly, our economy is very poor right now. And when I was talking with somebody in advance of this program, they said, you know, ask him if he doesn't worry that sometimes taking somebody and putting them into America right now with the poor economy and the lack of jobs isn't worse than having them stay where they were, because it's so difficult to find work now, and they only have 8 months, as I understand it, to become self-sufficient.
Well, I think there are two issues there. One is people we select to come here are selected according to criteria, as I say, of vulnerability, where we think that leaving them in camps will have very bad consequences. You know, you have women heads of household that could be discriminated against, people who will never be able to go back home, and therefore if they don't come here would probably stay in camps for their whole life, because we know they can't go back home even if the country improves, because they represent a subgroup that will remain targeted. So people who come here are those who most need this sort of solution, and I think the difficulties they face are probably, I would say, temporary or minor as compared to the rest. And I think that's one factor important to consider. The second one is that the government is also conscious that the program here might need some readjustment, and we're seeing moves in the administration to try to make sure that the NGOs who are helping these refugees are a bit better equipped.
And lastly, let me ask you about compassion fatigue, because now with 24-hour news channels and the availability of video, we see constantly pictures of people who need assistance. How do you, and people, frankly, some get resentful of people coming here from other countries and getting assistance when we do have a lot of needs here. What would you say to those people about that issue?
Well, I would say one thing. The UN has some purpose in the world, which is to make this world better, if possible, and to promote some concepts and some ideas. And the UN doesn't do it because it's the UN. The UN does it because it's a reflection of the best intentions of its better member states. So as long as our better member states keep on showing direction and examples, we have a cause to defend. If these examples die off, we don't have anything to defend. The UN is not an entity on its own. We are the representation.
So you would argue that people should still care about these refugees even when they themselves are hurting in the United States?
I think so. I mean, maybe not to the same level. I mean, it's not for me to make the decision. I mean, the government has to see what is also politically viable, etc. I understand that these are, again, legitimate concern, but we have seen no intention to stop these programs, and I think this shows that this country can endure difficulties without losing its more lofty ideals, and this is what makes one of the beauties of this country, to be honest.
Well, thank you very much. Time was short, but I really appreciate you being here and talking about refugee issues. You've been listening to Michel Gabadon. He is the U.S. and Caribbean representative to the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. I'm Marcia Franklin. Thanks for tuning in to this edition of Dialogue.
Presentation of Dialogue on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore family's legacy of building the great state of Idaho.